The first reading is taken from the Message, Deuteronomy, chapter 8. God is about to bring you into a good land, a land with brooks and rivers, springs and lakes, streams out of the hills and through the valleys. It's a land of wheat and barley, of vines and figs and pomegranates, of olives, oil, and honey. It's land where you'll never go hungry. Always food on the table and a roof over your head. It's a land where you'll get iron out of rocks and mine copper from the hills. After a meal satisfied, bless God, your God, for the good land he has given you. Make sure you don't forget God, your God, by not keeping his commandments, his rules and regulations that I command you today. Make sure that when you eat and are satisfied, build pleasant houses and settle in, see your herds and flocks flourish, and more money come in. Watch your standard of living going up and up. Make sure you don't become so full of yourself and your things that you forget God, your God, the God who delivered you from Egyptian slavery. If you start thinking to yourselves, I did all this and all by myself, I'm rich, it's all mine. Well, think again. Remember that God, your God, gave you the strength to produce all this wealth so as to confirm the covenant that he promised to your ancestors as it is today. Second reading is from the New Revised Standard Version, Psalm chapter 77. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. Thus ends the reading.
What a powerful and beautiful offering, and particularly apt for Thanksgiving Sunday. Thank you so much, choir. I suspect that many of you know the classic 1980 movie Airplane. It was among the first of several satires on disaster movies, and it went on to have a number of sequels. The setup for the film is simple. Both of the pilots on the plane had eaten the fish for dinner, and then it was discovered that the fish would cause severe, incapacitating gastric distress. You also know that this was a long time ago, since the airline was serving all the passengers in coach a hot meal. The pilots are indeed incapacitated, and a passenger has to come forward to the cockpit to fly the plane to a successful landing, despite his own fears that he's not talented enough to do so. But he does. And there is great and wild acclaim for his successfully landing the plane and saving the lives of all the crew and passengers. Here's my confession for the morning. That's one of my secret fantasies, too. Me, with my 250 hours of piloting single-engine propeller planes, am suddenly the only person who can save a jetliner full of people. And so, striding to the cockpit with manly resolve, I take the left seat. I don't know where the pilots went, but it's a fantasy. It doesn't have to make sense, right? I call air traffic control without a trace of nerves, tell them our predicament, and they find someone who successfully then talks me down to a grease-it-on landing. While from the back of the plane can be heard the shouts and the cheers of all those now safe passengers. I am modest on CNN as I'm being interviewed. But secretly I'm preening. All right, pretty silly, huh? Now it's your turn. What's your big fantasy? The big thing that you sometimes dream about doing that will be a game changer. Something truly wondrous and wonderful. Something that the world will ooh and ah over. For some people, that fantasy, that daydream has something to do with doing something great, something spectacular, something truly grand and glorious for God. But the great disciples, preacher, teacher, and storyteller Fred Craddock once had this to say about those sorts of grand fantasies versus the everyday realities of life and faith. Hear his wise words, quote, "To give my life for Christ appears glorious, and we sometimes think that giving our all to the Lord is like taking $1,000 bill and laying it on the table. Here's my life, Lord, I'm giving it all to you." But the reality, he says, for most of us is that God sends us to the bank and has us cash in that $1,000 for quarters. And we go through life, he says, putting our 25 cents here and there. We listen to the neighbor kids' troubles instead of saying, "Get off my lawn." We go to a committee meeting. We give a cup of water to an old man in a nursing home. For quite frankly, Craddock reminds us, quote, Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. It would be easy to go out in a flash of glory, but it's harder to live the Christian life little by little by little over the long haul. Our first scripture for this morning is the record of God's instructions to the people of Israel as they were camped across the river from the promised land, ready to finally finish the journey they had begun when they had fled Pharaoh in Egypt 40 years earlier. And I imagine that those who gathered there themselves had all kind of $1,000 thoughts and dreams running through their heads. Dreams of glory, dreams of doing something spectacular, something wonderful for God, dreams of doing something so fantastic in their new home that it would be talked about forever. $1,000 thoughts and dreams. But the reality was that over the next 10 generations in their new home, in that promised land, there were far, far more opportunities, as is the case in your life and mine, to do those 25-cent kind of actions than there were those dreamed about blaze of glory $1,000 opportunities. Because most of the things that make for starting a community and building a society from scratch are an accumulation of little things. There are trees to be felled so crops can be planted. There is the undramatic but essential work of finding clean water and making sure that everyone has enough of it. There are houses to be built and the hard work of clearing the land. And there is all the work that needs to be done, one small 25-cent step at a time, of building a new house of God, a new temple to replace that Ark of the Covenant they had so faithfully carried. And of course, you know what it's like to do a construction or renovation project, right? And with deadlines that simply come and go and laugh at you. And I suspect that they too wrestled with the same thing and wrestled with the hundreds of undramatic and 25-cent decisions about what kind of wood to use here and what color to paint the parlor. There were widows and orphans to be cared for, and the unexciting but absolutely essential 25-cent decisions that needed to be made about how to make sure that the most vulnerable did not fall through the cracks of this new society. I suspect that it was much the same on that first Thanksgiving on American soil almost 400 years ago. For at least some of the pilgrims also had come with high hopes, dreams of glory for God, big and dramatic $1,000 dreams of building a new Jerusalem that kept them excited on that long voyage across the Atlantic. But then the reality turned out to be so very different. Instead of the dramatic, instead of a blaze of glory, the pilgrims struggled with hundreds of 25-cent decisions about how to merely survive that first winter when over half of their company died. They struggled, since amazingly not a single one of that boatload of pilgrims had any experience farming. They struggled with all those oh so necessary but oh so small things that one has to do to make food come out of the ground. The $1,000 dreams, those blaze of glory fantasies were quickly replaced by the daily struggle just to survive. You see, Fred Craddock is right. Most of the decisions that you and I are called to make day by day by day by day about how to live as people of faith are not the huge, momentous, capital letter good versus evil kind of decisions. No, they are the smaller 25-cent decisions from that huge roll of quarters, as it were, that God has put in your pocket. They're the little things of life. A quarter's worth of decision here about whether to speak up or stay silent about something. A quarter's worth of decision there about deciding whether to confront racism or homophobia when it appears before you. A quarter's worth of deciding whether to speak directly to the person who has hurt you or whether instead take it to the gossip mill. Every single day, lots of 25-cent decisions about little but important things. How to be a good and faithful person, a good and faithful son or daughter, parent or grandparent, aunt, uncle or child, or citizen or church member. And consider this. It was not a huge, momentous $1,000 thing. It was not a spectacular, dramatic thing that saved those pilgrims. No, it was a little thing, a very little thing. But it was what allowed them to have that first Thanksgiving at all. It was a fish, a little tiny fish. One small fish. The Native Americans on that cold Massachusetts shore took pity on these bumbling, glory-bedazzled, woefully unprepared would-be settlers and told them a secret. Poke a hole in the ground, put the seed corn in the hole, then drop in a fish. One little fish. That one little fish, surely one of life's 25-cent little things, if there ever was one, is what made the corn flourish. The fish fertilized the soil, and it allowed the cornstalk not just to grow, but to flourish and be bountiful. So for better and worse, all the tragedy and the glory of the next several centuries of New England life was made possible by the Native Americans' little agricultural tip of one small fish dropped into one small hole. That's exactly the kind of thing our scripture has in mind this morning when it warns the Hebrew people of what they must never, ever, ever forget as they enter the new land. Hear it one more time. Make sure, the writer of Deuteronomy says, make sure that when you eat and are satisfied, when you build those pleasant houses, when you see your herds and your flocks flourish, and more money comes in, when you see your standard of living go up and up, make sure you don't become so full of yourself that you forget your God, the one who called you out of slavery. Don't start thinking, I did all this all by myself. Here's the point. The Hebrew people were to be the recipients of the fish that other people had dropped into the holes of their lives. those wheat and barley fields, those fig trees and abundant bread and honey didn't just spring up out of nowhere, but were all made possible by those before them who had done the hard work, the day in and day out labor, making thousands of 25-cent decisions about what to do and how to do it. And that's the lesson for us this morning as we anticipate Thanksgiving this week. For as we sit in this beautiful place this morning, surrounded by folks who give us life, I hope you realize that this Thanksgiving in this place with this people has indeed been made possible by God and the way that God worked through the lives of so many of our ancestors as they did the work of making this place a home, as they made all those little decisions that would, as it turned out, have very big consequences. We are here today at First Christian Church because of so many other people, past and present, who have helped us drop a fish into whatever hole was facing us, that our work, our ministry, our lives might flourish and be bountiful. You see, every one of us, every single one of us, is indeed the beneficiary of countless others who dropped fish into the holes of their soil, making possible a harvest in abundance, an inheritance that they themselves might never see. Every single one of us is the beneficiary of countless others who offered up their own quarters, as it were, toward what would become your life and mine. There are, despite the lie that the culture promotes, there are no self-made people, and there are no, certainly, self-made Christians. We are who we are because of all those little things, and no doubt some big things, that we have been the beneficiaries of. And that sentiment then is a fitting place to end this fall sermon series on the Psalms. For our psalm of the morning says of our Creator, "You are the God who works wonders." In the past, in the present, into the future, despite our anxieties, despite our worries and fears about ourselves, our families, our friends, our nation, our world, God will continue to seek to work wonders in ways large and small in every life. But that also means, as I have said more than once, that such a wonderful word of grace also comes to us as a word of challenge. And I believe that that word of challenge this Thanksgiving week is twofold. First, I invite you to think about someone in your past who helped to make you who you are. Someone who, perhaps when life was hard and hurtful for you, dropped their own little fish into your life in the way that made all the difference in your ability to move forward. And then find those people and say thank you to them. And then second, look around you this week for someone whose life needs a little fish in their soil. Is there a word that you can offer that would be the word that is needed? Is there something you can do that will be a small thing whose results could be very large? Most of us will never be given the opportunity to do, in Dr. Craddock's image, $1,000 thing. but we will be given the opportunity many, many, many times over to do many, many smaller things, which will have, like those first fish in those first seed holes at that first Thanksgiving, consequences that we may never imagine. And through the grace of God will indeed create bounty and blessing for those who will come after us. For such a word of grace, for such little but mighty opportunities, for those wonderful works of God indeed, I say, thanks be to God. Amen.